All right, wonderful to see everybody, or not see you, but wonderful to welcome you here. And sorry that we can't actually see you. Um, I want to welcome you all. I think some people will continue to sign in, but the musician we're listening to is Taina Asile and her band La Banda Rebelde, and it's her song We Are Rising. And let me just plug myself in. Um, So welcome to this conversation on building power for radical food system change with Navina Khanna of Heal Food Alliance. And I want to let people know this interview is hosted by the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale, also known as CBEY. And if you have questions today, you can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar. We're not going to be using the chat for questions, so please place things there. We're going to hold most of them until the end, but feel free to type them in as the conversation goes. My name is Tegan Engel, and I have been invited this year to serve as a resident fellow at CBEY to facilitate work on power and race in community business and the environment. And I have been working in food systems for about 25 years, first as a chef, and then for the last 15 years, I've been doing work on food justice and liberation work in a variety of different ways. And I'm really excited and grateful that you're all here today to learn about and explore this really important transformative work that Heal Food Alliance is doing. So Heal Food Alliance is made up of a number of different member organizations, including the Food Chain Workers Alliance, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Real Food Generation. And together, this alliance represents and is led by over 2 million rural and urban farm and food workers, as well as indigenous groups, organizations, activists, and policymakers. Heal's goal is to create a massive power shift so that we can transform our current food system so that it prioritizes people and the planet over profits. Navina Khanna is the founding director of Heal, where she leads this multi-sector and multiracial coalition work. And I'm really honored that she's made time to speak with us about it today. Navina, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with you. Thanks for having me, Tegan.
Absolutely. So your work is big and multi-layered and complex, but I know that you have a theory of change that sort of guides the way that you do your work. And I wanted to invite you to start there and explain a little bit about what is this theory of change and how does it affect the way that you approach your work?
Yeah. So, Heal, like you already said, it's a multi-sector, multiracial alliance of groups that are really coming together across race, across geography, across issue area, that are rooted in a common set of values, right? And part of what we understand together is that the current food system that we all have, that we're all existing in right now, is the way that it is because we have this mythology in our society that profit is more valuable than people or the planet.
Right.
And we understand that the destructive system really can only exist as long as we continue to put that profit over people on the planet. It's what drives all the extraction, the exploitation that we've seen throughout history and that we continue to see today. So, we ground what we're doing in that understanding and this valuing of life and the relationships that we hold as the most sacred thing. So that's kind of a fundamental. But we think about our theory of change in kind of like 5 buckets. So the first premise being that. And then also recognizing that, when we talk about the world that we want, which is one where all people have the right and the means to, be in their full power without exploitation of anybody else or exploitation of any other living beings, right. And have everything that they need in that way, that getting there is actually not politically possible right now. So we understand that our job as Heal is to make that more politically possible, right? Make it so. And we know that there's no one single organization or one sector or one group of people that can do that alone or in isolation, right? That the challenge that we're up against right now is huge, and that it's really going to take all of us. And so part of this idea of being an alliance is that we're really thinking about the different roles that each of us has, the relationships, the resources, the skills, the things that each of us can bring to the table, so that so we actually can make the scale of change that's needed, because it will take everyone to do that. And I think maybe most fundamentally in our conception of this is that we know that the people who made these systems be the way that they are not the ones who are going to, they don't have the solutions,
right?
How to get us out of here, right? So what we need to be looking to, and who we need to be looking to, are the folks who are most negatively impacted right now by the systems that we're in, and really looking to that leadership. So that's kind of like what grounds us, and then we, do our work in multiple arenas and multiple ways, but it's those threads that ground what we do.
Yeah, and I realize like it's important to put this in historical context also. Like, this country is founded on stolen land and genocide and an agricultural economy based on slavery. And so there's, in many ways, we have, while it has morphed and changed over time, we still have an agricultural economy that is based on not paying people very much, or not paying people what they're worth. And in some cases with like people in prisons who are growing food or producing food, and migrant farm workers and other things, we in many ways haven't moved so far away from that. And then when we look at the global economy, we still have that going on as well. So it is important to kind of, this isn't a new, sadly, horribly, this is not a new thing. Yeah, I appreciate your theory of change and this, the layers of it, because I think it can be very daunting to think about how do you go up against huge corporations, and how do you actually like change all these elements of our food system that are really controlled by people with a lot of power and money, and corporations with a lot of, and politicians with a lot of power and money. So could you give people an idea of all the elements that you're trying to change? You have a beautifully put together platform for real food. And I know that over 50 organizations came together and all of their members to kind of contribute to this. Can you share some information with people so they can understand kind of the elements of the food system that you're trying to transform?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen, and a bunch of us were seeing, that came together to form HEAL, is that folks were really fighting in isolation, right? So, workers had to fight for their own rights and dignity, and people who cared about organic were often, talking about that just in terms of personal health. People who really wanted sustainable agriculture for the sake of the environment weren't necessarily thinking about the whole economy and things like that. So part of our intention is recognizing together, like, we're all being screwed by the same system. And like you said, like, the number of people who are actually benefiting from the system is such a small handful of people, right? Like, I think I saw some stat recently that said that the people who are actually benefiting from like climate change being the way that it is could all fit on 2 Greyhound buses, right? Like, wow. Very few people are actually benefiting from the system. So we know that we're, trying to confront and dismantle this corporate control of our food system. These corporations control just like such a huge percentage of our food system, like 4 or 5 corporations. And we know that we're, working in this context of white supremacy and this legacy and the current reality of racism, as you named, right? So those are like kind of like the 2 premises of the things that we're trying to confront. But we recognize that we're all up against that, right? As workers, as farmers, as health advocates, whomever, we're all up against that. And so part of the coming together to develop this platform and really bringing together organizations, folks who had experience and expertise in each of the different areas that are in our platform, was to be able to say, not all of us can do all of the things that are in this platform, but we recognize that all of it needs to be done. And we recognize that, your your rights as a worker are as important as me getting paid enough as a farmer, is as important as ensuring the biodiversity of our ecosystems for everyone to thrive and so on. So that we could actually do that together. And so what we ended up doing is putting together this 10-point platform that you're referring to, that we are all in agreement that we will uphold each other's issues and not throw each other under the bus when it comes to trying to, advocate for any kind of policy changes or anything like that. And I actually, just to, take it out of theory and into what we actually mean and what we're talking about, we'll just like show a slide of what that platform actually is. So let's see if this will work. So now you're just seeing the whole thing instead of the current slide. Okay, so these are the 10 planks of our platform. So we have broken it out into economy, health, and environment. And of course, we know that what undergirds all of this is community control, community decision-making, us having collective stewardship of the system and getting it, again, out of the hands of those corporations and those greedy politicians that are benefiting from this, and really into our own. But these are the 10 planks. And so when we run through this, we're talking about things like, ensuring dignity for workers and their families. And that includes everything from what you were just saying around incarcerated people to people having safe working places and the right to organize, and reforming immigration laws in ways that are sustainable, for folks. I'm not going to run through all of these, but as you'll see in here, even with this idea of providing opportunity for all producers, what we've seen historically is that one group of people, white men specifically, 150 years ago, were basically given free land that was indigenous people's land. Black folks were promised 40 acres and a mule. They never got that. And what we've seen throughout the establishment of this country and what continues today is that Black folks, indigenous folks, other people of color don't get access to the same resources, even when they're trying to be in right relationship with the land and grow food for their communities. So ensuring that our institutions like the USDA and others are actually serving BIPOC producers and serving the public, right, instead of the private good. Yeah. So, we can go through the different planks of the platform, but really what they're all trying to do is get at this massive amount of corporate control that we have of our system, with specific policy proposals that will help get us to the kind of food system that actually works for all people on the planet. Invest in regional, local economies, ensures that people have access to affordable, healthy food, again, have the right and the means for it. There's greater transparency and accountability, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah,
and I guess just so people can understand, in a simple way, it's broken into 3 parts. There's kind of a number of recommendations under the economy, a number under health, and a number under the environment, and they kind of address specific things within that. So yeah.
And you can go to our website to see the whole thing.
Yeah, it's very easy to digest, and I'm interested to hear
for each one of them. Yeah.
And we'll get into it in a minute, but I want to hear a little more detail of like how you're actually trying to manifest some of these things. But I wanted to come back to this kind of core piece that is central to your work, which is that the work is directed by people who work in food, right? People who are farm workers, food workers, and work in other aspects of the food system. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I know you've said it a little already, but I just want to like emphasize this, because even though people might understand it sort of in theory, it really doesn't happen right now. Like, people who are workers do not actually get to have a lot of input into decision-making and how things happen, how things run. And I would love to hear you explain a little bit why that is so vital and why that is so important.
Yeah. And I think you named some of that already, right? That the roots of our food system here in the US, they really are rooted in stolen land, stolen labor, stolen lives. And while that was chattel slavery for a number of years, what we saw happen when the big policies that govern our current food system were drafted is that they excluded the people who held jobs that had been, work that had been done by formerly enslaved people, right? So the Fair Labor Standards Act that determines that we have a 40-hour work week and that there's minimum wage and things like that, that excluded farm workers, for example.
Right.
It also excluded domestic workers and other folks too. But what we, at the core, what we see over and over again is that the right for companies, for corporations to profit, the right for consumers to have access to food, we collectively as a society keep prioritizing that over the health and well-being and lives and livelihoods of the people who are actually working in our food system. And if you look across this country, I mean, pre-pandemic, there were 21.5 million people that worked in our food system. So that's like the biggest sector in our whole economy. But it's also where 5 of the 8 worst paying jobs are. And it's where people were even more dependent. I'm using were because I don't actually know the numbers during pandemic. And I know that, you know, there's been a bunch of
people have been
contract work and things like that that's really shifted. But people were 1.5 times more likely to need government assistance, things like food stamps and things like that, if they worked in food. So you get counties like Fresno County, you know, here in California, where I live, where we're growing the most fruits and vegetables in the country, feeding the whole country, but people, they also have the highest rates of food insecurity, right? People don't have access to enough food for their own communities. So part of what is critical, again, is this idea that, like, if we are going to have a food and agriculture system that actually works for people, then it's going to be because the people who, again, are being most screwed over right now are the ones who are saying what is needed and what has to change. So if, for example, we're saying that we don't want, you know, pesticides on our food anymore, like, who's most impacted right now by pesticides? It's the people who are actually spraying them, right? And people who live in neighboring communities. So what if those folks who don't want to be spraying pesticides, don't want to be sprayed by them, don't want their kids to have birth defects, like, if they had the right to organize and to speak out and weren't vulnerable to ICE or job loss or anything else, if they had the right to do that and the ability to do that and were supported in doing that, it could look tremendously different for everyone. Right? We would all benefit.
Right.
So
yeah, absolutely. And it's such a huge thing because, you know, we have all these labels that say organic or certified humane, or these things about how animals are treated, how food are treated. We don't have very many labels, almost at all, that talk about how workers are treated. And I think it is something that's really missing. Making visible kind of how workers are treated is something that you know, is something that's really hidden in our society. And I appreciate the work you're doing because you're trying to undo that, and that others are doing.
Yeah.
Could you get into
also that there are workers organizing themselves, you know, to make sure that they are the ones drafting the standards, you know, for the labels and holding folks accountable. And if folks want to learn more about that, I really recommend checking out the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Fair Food Standards and the work that they've been doing on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how some of the multi-sector organizing works. Like, so people who didn't formally talk to each other, maybe the workers who need support in organizing, and then people who are fighting for, you know, as you said, like organic labeling or other things. Can you describe a little just how you've, maybe in very concrete ways, like how have you gotten people talking to each other and then collaborating on campaigns or on policies or other things?
Yeah. So I will say first that, you know, we're not the big tent, right? Like folks who join HEAL join because they are aligned in values and aligned in vision. And there are plenty of, you know, like coalitions or networks or things like that out there where it's just like, oh yeah, we care about food and we're all, you know, here. We're not that. So folks that are joining HEAL are committing to doing that work together and doing the deep work to understand each other's issues and to they want to work in solidarity with each other, right? That doesn't mean that everyone necessarily understands all of each other's issues or how to work best with each other or all of that, but the folks are committed to it. And so we literally, like, one of our, we talk about our work in terms of like 5 core methods of what we do. One of our core methods is that we are connecting and uniting folks together. So that means you know, IRL, before we were all in virtual worlds, bringing folks together in a room to be in conversation with each other. So we started this whole process by just bringing folks from base building groups who, that means that they, you know, are organizing with people in community, with the people most impacted in community, together into a room to talk about, you know, what is our shared vision? What are we working towards? And then what are the shared values that move us towards that? And then let's talk about what's the strategy, what are the steps that we need to take to get from where we are right now in a way that matches our values, that leads us towards our vision. And when we first started bringing folks together, it was actually you know, a pretty transformative process for folks to be able to be in that and find that commonality, because so much of what has been called the food movement and has been, you know, this is like the dominant voices in the so-called food movement have been mostly white voices, mostly male voices, a lot of academics and authors and things like that. And so to bring folks together to be in that was valuable. And it was through that folks, you know, named, you know, let's stop talking to each other about this stuff and let's actually start working on some campaigns together. So we started, you know, in that conversation around strategy, thinking about like, what are some campaigns that we could win on together? And what are some campaigns that would move us towards more structural change, right? So for example, we were all agreed from the outset that if we're really going to address corporate control in our food system, we need stronger antitrust laws that will actually make sure that there's no more of these mergers and monopolies and things like that. We need them enforced. We need to, you know, break up that whole system. We knew we were not going to be able to do that overnight. Right. It's not politically possible. But what's the campaign that a bunch of groups have a stake in and could work on together to start building our momentum towards that, while actually, you know, winning substantive change for their communities? So, for example, some of our members from the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, so they work with fishers, and a couple of farming groups like Operation Spring Plant, so Black farmers in North Carolina, students who are on campuses around the country, organized through Real Food Generation, and Fair World Project that was working on standards for workers, and a handful of other organizations, ASPCA and others, came together saying, you know, we could work together on targeting 3 corporations that really hold a bunch of the food industry in their pocket. They have a stranglehold on it, 3 food service corporations, and then starting to organize together around a set of demands. And I think the first, you know, comprehensive set of demands that gets at labor standards, environmental standards, animal welfare standards, tries to increase contracts for BIPOC producers, kind of like has that whole gamut together, right, that everyone's going to throw in on these demands, hold these corporations accountable to that, build our muscle and momentum together, and you know, learn how to run that kind of campaign as a coalition of folks that might not have come together in this way before.
And what happened with that campaign?
We're working on it.
You're in it. Is that what is the name of that? That's the
Real Meals campaign.
The Real Meals. Okay.
Yeah. So we just had a victory on that. We just secured a commitment from one of those corporations publicly. Hopefully the others will come along soon. But Aramark just committed to not ever selling any genetically modified salmon, and they're also working with us on securing contracts with some BIPOC producers. At some of their institutions. So we're on our way on that campaign, and we have a long ways to go to really, you know, transform things.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a simple thing to even just finding BIPOC producers that can sell at the scale that these huge corporations need. Like, there's so many elements that need to be built up to support all of that functioning, but is really great to get
investment in infrastructure for BIPOC producers to have that. And
yeah, but getting them on board to say they'll do it is good. And I mean, I actually was part of working to. I worked in Yale Dining actually many years ago when they were right in the moment where Aramark was being kicked out. So I experienced it there. And I also worked with New Haven Public Schools in a moment where Aramark was being kicked out, and so have really experienced sort of the differences between food service, labor standards, other things in both of those institutional environments around that. And it's a big deal to get that kind of change in an institution of that size. Like, it's very big business, you know, and so getting people on board and all the logistics they need to make those kinds of changes is not a small thing.
Yeah. And the thing that we learned from, one of our member organizations trying to do it on every college campus, like one campus at a time, is like there's a stranglehold, right? So we need to go to the companies themselves, and then where they're sourcing from downstream, and the kickbacks that they have in place and things like that.
Right. But then the impact that you can have when you hit something at that level is huge. So if you get a change on salmon on like one ingredient, but at such a huge scale, I mean, it's a thing, right? I mean, figuring out how much work it takes to make all the little changes at a small scale versus like one big change at a time at a larger scale can actually have an impact.
Yeah. I think just one other thing that I wanted to say around you were asking like, how do we do it? I think one of the things that we understand and like why we do the work this way is that all movement is rooted in relationship, right? So really striving to like build strong relationships, sometimes through the work that we're doing, but also through learning about what each other are doing, how we do it, being in community together, so for example, we run like a school of political leadership, and that's where I'm just coming from today. We just had a session with our school. But normally,
please tell people a little what that is. Like people apply and
folks apply, teams apply to learn skills in campaign strategy and power mapping and policy advocacy and things like that. But when we're able to do that in person, what we're doing is we're going into a community that we have a relationship with, and we're learning from organizers who have been organizing that community for a long time, and we're maybe doing a work day together and building skills simultaneously, but really rooting in that shared, political analysis together, building the relationships, and starting from that place so that the change that we make is really transformative, not just transactional.
Can you share a little bit? I love getting into sort of the people hearing and understanding some of the actual practices. So like, if you're teaching people about campaign work and like going out and building relationship with people and listening, like is there like one or two practices or skills that you teach that you think would be valuable for people to hear about, to just understand kind of how to do things that not just imposing on people, right, from the top down, but what that means in practice, building relationship and that kind of listening?
Yeah, so I think one of this is so fundamental, but really just like doing what's traditionally in organizing called a one-to-one, where we literally, either pick up the phone or get together in person and have a genuine conversation with someone around the issues that matter to each of us and what our shared stake is in creating change, so that we can come together around, whatever our shared, not only our shared issue and stake, but also, shared targets, right? So when we talk about the targets, we're talking about like who actually has the power and ability to change the circumstance for us. And so how do we build together enough that we can hold those targets accountable? So then one other like hard skill that we talk about and that we try to build is how to do power mapping, right? So how to look at like who actually, and again, maybe they just fit on those 2 Greyhound buses, but who actually is benefiting from the system the way it is, and who has the power to make decisions around where resources are flowing. So, on a very local level, that might just be, your city council is the one that can make the decision around whether or not your community, for example, has a climate action plan and is going to do something that includes food and agriculture systems. And if that's the case, then like who can you build with that can then build with the next person that can then make sure that you have a substantial meeting with your council person, that you're building their momentum together, getting them in a conversation. It's really about relational organizing, so that we're looking at the whole system together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Are there other campaigns that you want to share about to help people understand just some of the ways that you're trying to make this change, and maybe in particular around COVID and the way that COVID has affected food workers, just so people can understand sort of the avenues that you're going through to try to affect this change across the system?
Yeah, so maybe one thing I'll say is that HEAL as an alliance runs some campaigns together. So like, for example, the Real Meals campaign that we talked about, or a program like the School of Political Leadership that we run. And then there's things that our members are leading on, and that as a movement infrastructure, we really strive to support and to amplify and to build further relationships around. But so, for example, some of our member organizations like Venceremos in Arkansas, Rural Community Workers Alliance in Missouri, Idaho Organization of Resource Councils in Idaho, of course. They are all in places where there are huge meat packing plants, and they have been working with workers in those meat packing plants for many, many years, and have real relationships, because even though COVID-19 really illuminated for so many people that we have a food system, and that food workers are essential workers and all of that, like as we've talked about already, like none of this is new, right? People have been exploited since the beginning of our food system. So folks have been doing that work and deep work in community for a long time. And one of the things that they were finding off the bat is that the workers that they organized with were not getting access to personal protective equipment. They were being forced to stand shoulder to shoulder. They were being told that they couldn't take sick days, even if somebody at the plant, clearly had COVID, that they thought that they were exposed, or that they might even have it, that they need to stay home. They were being penalized for that kind of thing. So really, through the leadership of those members who are rooted in community, we've been working, for example, for this past year to amplify that and to fight for protections for workers. And I just want to name that, we talked in the beginning around like the vision and these, values and all of these things of like what we're striving towards. What that literally has meant this last year is being like in defense mode, right? Trying to just make sure that folks have basic protections, and they still don't, right? We're still fighting for those. We're hoping that in these next couple of weeks, we'll see something change. There's a new bill being introduced next week around slowing down the line speeds at these processing plants. But what we saw this last year is that the federal government, put out this executive order that was written by the companies saying that the plants should stay open and that they were not liable for anything that happened to their workers. And as a result, we've seen tens of thousands of workers be exposed to COVID. And of course, the surrounding communities have been some of the major hotspots in the country.
Right. Yeah. Can you talk about in that a little bit? Like, so we have OSHA, right? That's supposed to oversee working conditions. And this is like a federal office and has standards. And so can you explain, like, why is this not happening in our meatpacking plants? And why is it not a simpler thing to just say, make sure OSHA is doing its job?
Yeah, so OSHA actually does not have an emergency temporary standard around or any
around COVID. Okay.
A respiratory disease.
Okay.
And Congress has to authorize or mandate that OSHA do that. And given the political context that we've been in this last year, the last 4 years, that wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. So one of the things we've been trying to push for is for OSHA to develop that standard. And thankfully, this new administration did issue an executive order within the first couple of days of being in office that directs OSHA to identify whether or not a standard is needed. Yeah, it's ridiculous. We're still hoping that they will, say that it is, and they will listen to workers. Because I think one of the big things that's happening, it's not just that, OSHA doesn't have that, but also because of the many, many reasons why workers are so vulnerable because of, our immigration standards and systemic racism and threats of job loss and things like that too. Workers can't necessarily speak out all the time. Without fear of retaliation. They've been walking off the job, they've been striking, they've been doing a bunch of things. And actually, one of our members and co-founders, the Food Chain Workers Alliance, just put out a report that came out yesterday that documents tremendous stories from their members, our members who have been organizing around the country in the face of COVID. That's really worth people checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've noticed a lot, actually, the amount of organizations that support food workers are getting out a lot of individual stories, I think, to try to get people to understand, like, these are human beings who, and how they're being treated, to make this like visible. And it's not, before COVID, OSHA was not overseeing things that they're mandated to oversee even. So even outside of a respiratory illness. So yeah, I encourage people to check that out. Are there other campaigns you want to share about or get people aware of and involved in?
Yeah, so there's so much, and I encourage folks to go to our website to learn more. Yeah. But one other just campaign that we're working on is a community level campaign called Good Food Communities. That's similar to the Real Meals campaign in that it is about standards for procurement. But the purpose of this campaign is to get all public dollars spent on food, whether that's in schools, hospitals, prisons, wherever, daycare centers, that those are public dollars can only go towards companies that are actually complying with basic labor standards and environmental standards and so on. So we call that Good Food Communities, and it's something that folks have passed here in Oakland, something similar in LA, Boston, Chicago. Folks are working on it in Buffalo. And so basically in cities around the country, counties around the country, people are working on it. But there's room for more. If people want to do that in their own communities. We've been able to move several hundred millions of dollars away from really bad actors through that. And our work now is to try to make sure that gets invested in the right places.
Yeah, that's great. I want to encourage people, if you want to start posting some questions in the Q&A, you can do that. And I'm going to ask one last question while we wait to see if people have questions. I think you maybe answered this a little, but from an organizing standpoint and a movement standpoint, I was wondering how you would respond to this question about how do you keep focused and prioritize so that you can be effective in your work and not just get spread too thin in your organizing?
Yeah. Me personally, or
either way. I guess as an organization is what I was thinking, but you can certainly.
No, let's talk about it as an organization. So I think one of the key things is really just knowing our role, right? Knowing like what is not being done by anyone else that we really need to do. And to really know the roles, for example, of our members, right? And to make any assessment about whether or not we're going to take something on as is this actually necessary? Will this actually move us closer towards our vision? Will this actually have tangible benefits for people who are most negatively impacted right now? We ask ourselves questions as are our members actually interested in this thing? Is it something that they are leading on that we can support? And really to know, if there's somebody else that's already doing it, how can we just be supportive of what other folks are doing? And then if not, what are the ways that we need to push or do something else? And I think one of the things we've really seen in this last year is just how much HEAL as an alliance, as a BIPOC-led, multiracial, multi-sector alliance is actually necessary in this space, in large part because of the relationships that we've built, right? Because of that, we've been able to pivot and adapt and move together, even in the face of COVID, because of those relationships that we've built and been able to take action together because of that. And because of that, a lot of other groups that don't have those rooted relationships have turned to us to inform, their policy advocacy and things like that too.
Yeah, that's
but
great.
If someone already doing it, great, do that. we don't need to be duplicative.
Yeah, and I appreciate also that I think part of the strength of doing coalition work is, as you said, there's things that you're running, and then there's things that you're partnering with other people on. And I think we live in such a culture of people wanting to have attention, kind of being famous for something, or individualism. And I think that there's so much power in working in coalition, and as you said, sort of knowing where your skill sets are and then where you can step into partner with other people. And And I find myself encouraging people, like as I get older and people come and ask me advice about things, I often find myself saying like, who's doing what you want to do, and how can you join them, especially if it is Black, Indigenous, or people of color led, especially for white folks or even just young folks. Like, you don't have to start something from zero. Like, go, how can you support what's out there already? And then how can you build on it, right? Like if you want to join something like a campaign you're doing, but then as you build relationship and listen and you find out, well, you're needing support on communications and social media, or you are really needing more grassroots on the ground organizers to go talk to workers, or, and kind of starting from that place rather than starting something new all the time. And I think just joining in coalition and being able to have an impact at a larger level, because we tend to have this approach of like, for years in this country, that people can just vote with their dollars, like as individuals, kind of what we buy. And while that can have some impact, when you look at the scale of what we need to change, trying to figure out how can you have an impact at purchasing that goes, across dozens of institutions, or that, affects things at a much, much larger level, or that isn't about purchasing at all, that's about making policy changes or other systemic changes. And those kinds of things, you need to be in coalition, you need to be working at a larger level. So I really appreciate the way that you do that, both the coalitions that you run as well as the things that you join into, I think is important.
Yeah, and it's both, right? It's like the scale of change that we're trying to make, like you said, can only happen through mass movement and mass action. And like, there just isn't room for ego, there isn't, like, nobody actually has time to do every single thing. We are all going to burn out if we try to do every single thing. And really just like trusting each other to take action when it's needed is part of this whole thing too, right? It's like, even when I think about, in my own community and showing up to like protests or action or things like that, like I can't go to every single one, and that's okay, right? There's enough of us and we trust each other enough that like someone else can go to this one and I'll go on Saturday. And,
right.
It's about being in, that's why it's so important, I think, to find a political home, right? For like something like HEAL is a political home for many folks. And in our own communities, we find political home too, right? That we can move together.
Yeah, there's a question here asking, is HEAL partnering with any organizations in the Hudson Valley or of New York State?
Yeah, some of our members are based in the Hudson Valley, like, for example, Soulfire Farm, who many people are familiar with. It's in Hudson Valley. And then there are several statewide organizations in New York that we work with. So, for example, Rural Migrant Ministry is in New York, and the Worker Justice Center of New York, and a bunch of other groups. You can, not to just keep directing people to our website, but on our website, we have a map of our members, and folks can check out our members and where they're based, and there's a bunch in New York.
Yeah, you have an amazing website. Clearly, like, somebody loves writing and designing and organizing information. It's really, I really encourage people to go check it out. You can learn a ton from reading the different materials.
Yeah, we have a brilliant communications team.
Awesome. I was curious if you could speak about, in this moment where there's like a rising awareness, not among white folks and around some people in positions of power around systemic racism. I'm wondering if you're seeing any changes in white-led organizations in terms of their pivoting or being able to follow rather than lead, or any other kinds of things about how they're partnering with you or partnering with other BIPOC-led groups and efforts.
Yeah, I'm seeing some, obviously, like, an organization is made up of individuals, right? And I think that what's particularly in this last year with the uprising and the real, like, reckoning that I think this country is having with race, we're seeing folks start to get out of their silos a little bit and start to take action, for each other. So, for example, for example, an organization like Friends of the Earth, who's not a member of HEAL, but is one of our partners, and who historically has primarily done, strict environmental work and animal rights work. Like, they've been amazing partners this last year in the fight for essential worker protections, and they've really thrown down and mobilized their resources to action. And I think we're seeing more and more of that kind of thing, where again, organizations that didn't before think about worker issues or Black farmer issues or whatever they, whatever they're able to like say like, oh, that's not our thing, like are starting to say like, oh, we actually can talk about that too. National Farmers Union has been putting out statements about racial justice a lot, right, and calling out a lot of things. So I think on the one hand, we're seeing a shift, and we're seeing organizations trying to grow and trying to work together. I think that in the scheme of like who we celebrate, who we lift up, particularly who we invest in, I think that that's where we're still looking for a lot more change, from philanthropy, from funders, from folks who have the resources. Because if you look at any significant change that's happened through history, it's grassroots groups, it's frontline groups that have been leading that change, and who are, whether or not they're funded to do it, are going to do what's needed in their community. And that's what we've been seeing through COVID, and we've see through climate chaos. Like, folks just throw down in their own communities, and people have done this mapping, for example, of the environmental movement, seeing that like 95% of funding in an environmental movement has gone towards white-led organizations, and that's the big greens. But nearly every win that's happened has been because of a grassroots frontline organization. And
which
so
is mostly
really,
Black, brown, and Indigenous people who are doing the work and organizing, and the people who are most impacted by.
That's right.
Harms,
yeah.
Right.
So imagine if that 95% or even 50% of that funding went towards those groups,
right?
What they could do.
Yeah. And that's so important. I'm glad you said that, because I think, it is sort of a thing right now, people making statements, but what's really important is the actions that people take to do something about systemic racism and do something differently, whether it's partnering or whether it's getting resources and funding or other things to.
That's also just talking about like the nonprofit world, right? We're not even talking about like
the business world.
Pepsi made a statement, right? About Pepsi is still, targeting Black youth in particular, and messing up people's health for the long haul. In significant ways, and they're getting away with it.
Sure.
So actions.
Yeah, there's a question here about what is HEAL's relationship to organizing around abolition and against the prison industrial complex. Not sure if that's too much mission creep, but it seems, this is this person writing, but it seems like fighting against criminalization would be central to food justice, like what you said about ICE and farm workers. What would that mean for working with organizations like Aramark, who profit from public prison contracts? Is abolition among your demands? And thanks for doing this talk. Yeah, great question.
Love you, anonymous attendee. I don't know if you're all the same anonymous attendee, but love you, anonymous attendee. Agreed. Yeah, we actually, a couple years ago, started like a full exploration of the corporations, particularly food corporations, that are benefiting from not just prison labor, but also the ways that they are. So there's a couple pieces of this. One is that people who are incarcerated can be put to work and can be put to work at like really, really low wages if paid at all. And that's often on penal farms, right? Or it's for like food, even for high-end companies, right? So like making like craft cheeses and things like that and getting paid like 29 cents an hour. So we started mapping out not only where those prisons are that are, using that kind of labor, but also like who are the corporations that are benefiting from this, and really trying to draw out some of those connections between the prison industrial complex and the food system being the way that it is. Yes, to being an abolitionist group, we would like to see an end to the prison industrial complex in all forms, and real work towards restorative justice in all of our communities. And I think that there is like much more work for all of us to do together to really draw that out and to make the kinds of changes that we want. So for example, like this anonymous attendee talked about Aramark profiting from the prison industry. Aramark also, you know, like is a food service in prisons.
Right.
And what that looks like is that folks who are incarcerated are like literally the ones making the meals for themselves and like really crappy food. Impact Justice just put out a great report this last year that I'm hoping will be informative for all of our organizing work around the food service industry and the prison industrial complex and the like really low quality of food and things like that folks are served. So yeah, everything that we're talking about in terms of like not only the ways that like labor and food service and things like that are upheld in our food system, but also, you know, when you start breaking it down to how population is being tracked, right? And so like part of what we're always thinking about is how are we like bridging the urban-rural divide and you know, thinking about how folks are represented in governance and things like that in their area. And one of the things that is happening is that a large number of prisons, particularly private prisons, are being placed in rural areas. And so we're just like furthering that divide in so many ways. And when we're thinking about like, what does it mean to support, you know, rural communities and the kinds of changes, like there's some deep examination and exposure, I think, that's needed there. As we're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that question was asked. It's really, really important. We're coming to the end of our time. I'm wondering if there's any other piece of this that feels important to share about the work or how people can get, do you want to just share like how people can get engaged if they want to help?
Sure. HEAL itself is made up of organizations, not of individuals, but a lot of those organizations are local organizations. So I, again, encourage folks to check out, like if there are orgs that are in your area or communities, or if you're interested, you know, in starting a campaign, like a Good Food Communities campaign in your own area, to like check that out. But if people are interested in like furthering some of the work or the ways that we talk about it, we're always looking, you know, if you go on our website, like I said, we're doing those like platform plank explainers and things like that. We're always looking for help with things like developing infographics and doing more communications about the issues that really matter to our members. The person who talked about the prison industrial complex, if there's things that you know and think that we should be like turning into formats that we can reach broader audiences and things like that, that's all very, very welcome in terms of how we think about partnership. But yeah, website is where you can find most of our information, and feel free to drop us a line if there's specific ways that you want to get engaged to.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, thank you for all the work you're doing, and thank you for taking this time to explain it and answer some questions about it. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Tegan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Bye, everybody.